My guest this week is Grant McPhee. Grant is a film director and a music writer who started his film career in the camera department and has worked on feature films for over 20 years. His first self-directed feature film was Big Gold Dream, a documentary on independent labels Fast Product and Postcard Records, which had a BBC screening and was listed on Sight and Sound's Best Films of 2015. His next documentary, Teenage Superstars, covered the Glasgow 1980 and 1990s indie scenes, which received Pick of the Day reviews in The Guardian, The Times, The Independent, and The Sun when it was screened on Sky TV. His books include Postcards From Scotland, Scottish Independent Music 1983 to 1995, and he also co-wrote the book Hungry Bee. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie, Grant McPhee. Hi, Grant.
Hi, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being up.
No, thank you. I'm absolutely honored to be here. It's a pleasure.
I had your documentaries at the video store. Sometimes I had to get Region 2 stuff to kind of throw at people to be like, all right, you're going to have to buy a special player to watch this. But, you know, as I said in your introduction, you've made all these films about the Scottish punk, post-punk, and indie pop scenes, and they're fabulous. But do you feel pressure to be the person that's kind of bringing the spotlight on it? Because you've also have your new book too. So do you feel kind of a bit of pressure or maybe even a little bit of a target in terms of what to include and not to include?
It's been a journey. I don't feel pressure. It's something that I hugely enjoy doing, and it came together completely by accident. It was never intended to be that I'm going to start documenting this part of the Scottish scene and then the second part of it. It was just purely something which came together, I think, in the best possible way by accident. I think when I started one of the documentaries, Big Gold Dream, it was purely because I was interested in the subject and I had no illusions that it would be anything beyond just sending a VHS to some of the participants. And, I'm absolutely delighted that this story, which is so important to me, has been spread throughout, and speaking to people like yourself in a different country. And, hopefully having introduced some of these bands which were new to me, to other people, that's the reason why I do it.
Well, I found out about some of the bands through your films. I mean, I was obviously aware of the Vaselines and Teenage Fanclub and even the Fire Engines, but like the BMX Bandits were not on my radar. I don't think they really resonated in the US. I don't think they had kind of a big reach, but I became obsessed with them after seeing who he is, like Douglas just being such a character, and their origin story between the people in Teenage Fanclub and Soup Dragons and him, and the unlikely mental space they're in that they would be like, well, what would your acceptance speech be if you won a music award? And they didn't even have bands yet. They were just dreaming. And I took a quote here from your book that Douglas Stewart from the BMX Bandits says, and I thought it was lovely. He says, I think that the family of bands that was emerging here, I keep using the word which feels like it now represents something different, alternative. It seemed like genuine misfits and outsiders, and the records had a much more human quality. Sometimes technically the ambition would be beyond the actual grasp of what the musicians could achieve, but actually hearing that you could be something that's quite special, and also a bit like, well, if these guys can do it with their limited skills, they don't fit in, and they're not really playing the game, we might have a connection with them in a way. And I feel like your film's going to have that same spirit, telling the stories you kind of didn't know who was going to be available and where the grasp or what the reach of this documentary would be.
I think if for me, when I started the first documentary, it was, as I mentioned, purely as a music fan. And this was in 2005, and it was just slightly ahead of when some of the BBC Four documentaries came out, although it didn't arrive until far later, just really from the nature of how it was made. But there was a film that I'd seen called Made in Sheffield, which was about the Sheffield. And yeah, it was just such a huge inspiration to me. And it was made, to me in what I perceived to be like a DIY fashion. It wasn't made with like fancy equipment. And, to me, that was incredibly inspiring. And at that time, now we have so much fantastic equipment like we do in music and film available to us, like for little expense. And unfortunately, at that time, the equipment, even to make something, sort of like reach half decent quality, was like incredibly expensive. I had to save up and hire equipment, and that's why it took so long to make. And it really was just jumping in with no real support other than a few friends from the film industry. But what was amazing to me from my experiences as a camera technician, I'd been working in the film industry, but not as a director. Um, when I spoke, I remember somebody once saying to me, uh, a fellow sort of co-worker in the film industry, and it just fascinated me. I'd mentioned that I was going to make this film, and they said to me, "What do you want to make a film for?" And it just sort of blew my mind that this person in this creative industry of making films was just aghast that somebody wanted to go out and make their own film. And nobody really
Wow.
was interested in helping. But when I spoke to the musicians, that was a completely different story. They had no interest in sort of like previous experience or anything like that. It was I'd spoken to somebody called Manny who was in Win, a fantastic character, and he asked me, if you could make a documentary, what would you make it on? And just remembering that Made in Sheffield story, I just said, oh, I'd love to make a film on Postcard Records, not really having any, sort of like idea that this could be sort of possible. And he just said, okay, I'm going to phone Malcolm Ross. And straight away, he was on the phone to Malcolm Ross
Oh,
arranging
wow.
a meeting. And, my nature is like, I'm quite reserved and I'm not really a sort of Andrew Goldham hustler for, sort of trying to push my way into these industries. And I was sort of, it's like, whoa, no, this can't possibly be happening. So, the next day I was in a cafe speaking to Malcolm Ross, who to me was this, musical legend. In my eyes, that was like meeting like David Bowie, or, because he'd been in so many, to me, like illustrious bands, and he was telling me about all these other bands and that he could put me into touch with people, and nobody had any reservations about asking for my like CV, or what other things I'd done, or how I was going to approach this. It was just like, yeah, we can do this, we can do this. And it was just that idea. It just made me think that this could be done, and that it was something that could also exist within filmmaking, this DIY approach. And I think if I hadn't had that reaction, certainly it wouldn't have been made. And that was really the approach we took. It was just, it was almost created without any intention, in the same nature as some of the music came from. And I think probably a lot of the musicians could probably see, that I was coming to this from, good intentions. My approach
Yeah.
was never to, you know, make any money from this, thankfully, because I never have. And I think it was just they saw that I was just genuinely wanting to tell their story, and unfortunately, it took a long time to do. But we did it, and it really, to me, just reinforced, it's something that's been such a huge influence on my life. It's just this DIY attitude that is something available to everyone. It sounds like a cliche, but you can go and do things yourself. As the music has proven, like on smaller scales to things that I've done, and that's just purely from this universal do-it-yourself attitude, which is at the root of the subject matter of everything I do, and really by um, just the constraints that I have, like the process of what I do as well.
Well, it's kind of amazing. Were you shocked that this hadn't really been documented in this fashion?
Yeah, absolutely. I had, in Scotland, postcard has always been, a big thing. It really did change Glasgow and, the perception of Scotland within the music industry and, the UK-wide music industry. So, Scotland, postcard has always been something big in, and when I say big, I mean in terms of like a music fan's knowledge of Glasgow. I was, very much into like punk and post-punk bands, and like postcard obviously was like part of that. And to me, that was my, you know, knowledge of Scottish indie slash punk music. And, that's why I wanted to make a documentary on Postcard Records. But when I met Malcolm, he started telling me about bands that I'd never heard of, like the Scars. And
Yeah, me either.
yeah, and it's just like, well, what do you mean? These other bands, and bands from Edinburgh, and what just a moment that sort of blew my mind, because as I mentioned, I was really into post-punk music, and one of the big bands for me was Joy Division slash New Order, and they were my favorite band, and I was sort of obsessed with them. People at school would say, when you start the Joy Division fan club, and um, so I had, like, at that time, as much knowledge as you could sort of like gain from, you know, music books and magazines and, word of mouth from people. This is long before the internet. So I was aware that they'd had a release on Fast Product. And to me, that was, just, I had never heard of them other than this 12-inch that they did, an earcom compilation, it was called. And when Malcolm said that the Scars were on this label, Fast Product, which was like from Edinburgh, it was just like, what do you mean? How can this record label, which put out a Joy Division release, be from Edinburgh?
Yeah, Human League and the Mekons, right?
Yeah, Mikens and Gang of Four.
Yeah, and this is like before Rough Trade
Yeah,
even. It's wild.
it was just such a strange thing to be told. And, I'd every day walk down the street where they've been based, and it was like a small tenement flat, which is, like the apartments you have in New York. And it was just, well, how could this be? And, that just like, it was a light bulb moment in my head where I thought, wow, this is something that's like interesting, and these connections haven't been made. And as you mentioned, the Human League, and, everyone, regardless of whether you're a fan of like obscure bands, knows who the Human League are. But, Don't You Want Me was number one in America and in the UK. And to learn that they had a release, not just had a release on a Scottish indie label for their first single, but they were managed by people from Scotland. And
Yeah, Bob Last.
yeah, it's just like, what do you mean? How can this be possible? And, then when he started finding out that, Bob Lass and Hilary Morrison were roadies, then managers for the Rosellos, and Joe Callis, who was the songwriters from the Rosellos, was brought in by Bob into the Human League to write Dare for them.
He does that thing too where Bob like tries to split Human League into two bands, Heaven 17 and Human League, so he can manage both and kind of be a Svengali. And it worked for both, but it's really strange to hear the members. It's weird to hear Bob talk about it in the documentary, as well as the members of Human League talk about it and kind of be like, I can't be mad at him. He's a good guy, whatever. Bob has such a strong kind of traditional record label kind of persona in an indie world. He's very like tough minded, no bullshit, I'm going to do this. I'm going to find my version of Buzzcock Spiral Scratch and make a movement. Where Postcard, who's doing like Orange Juice and did Joseph K, were they on Postcard as well?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Their Svengali is like this Andy Warhol type who wants to be out front in an artistic way, right? He wants to be as big a name as the artist. And even the interviews you have in that, the archival footage where he's like throwing stuff around the room, he's like, oh, yeah, here's some mail and here's some tax stuff. You just get a sense that, yeah, this guy wants to be the star and the focus. And it's fascinating. These two small labels made a limited amount of stuff, like 12 releases each. And Tony Wilson from Factory was like calling up Bob Last and being like, how do you do what you do? And even just the influence of these small labels really kicking the door into the underground is incredible, and a story that I feel like I didn't know.
Yeah, it's I think Scotland's history of music prior to fast product is it's really not much happened apart from one significant event, and I constantly try to reassess these stories, and Scotland didn't really do punk music, and almost seemed to go straight on to post punk. But I think the reason why Bob Last and Alan Horn were so successful as impresarios wasn't from Malcolm McLaren or Tony Wilson. It was like from the Bay City Rollers, which seems like a crazy thing to say, but the Bay City Rollers manager is you have to be very careful when you talk about him, because subsequently, you know, the revelations which came about him, which were like happening, during his career, the guy was, a monster, but at the time, the public's perception of him was very different. And I think his perception for Malcolm McLaren was something that was, I think, instrumental in how the Sex Pistols operated. You'd had impresarios in the past like Angela Goldham and obviously Brian Epstein from the Beatles, but they were very much based in London. In the United Kingdom, if you wanted to be a successful pop act, you had to move to the centre of where the music business was. And when the Bay City Rollers, people talk of them as a manufactured band in terms of like how the Monkees were manufactured, but they were very different. They were very against record labels. Their manager had the reason they had huge success wasn't from record label manipulation. They'd had a small hit, but for years they hadn't had any interest at all. And they had a Bay City Rollers like fan club, which was run from a council house, which is a sort of social housing in a small village outside of Edinburgh, by the manager's mum. On, it was just like a genuine sort of like, when we talk about indie label artists like folding up their record labels in their bedroom and post them out, that's how they operated. And as they became popular throughout like different cities, as the Bay City Rollers sort of like progressed down towards London, they still weren't getting, all their records, even including Saturday Night, was just, complete flops until their manager had an idea of using their fan club to send out postcards telling them about their new record was going to be released. And they managed to have, it was like 10 or 20,000 postcards sent out to these fans. And because in the day the record was released, all these fans bought it. It made the record labels and the promoters think, whoa, what's going on here? What's this single that everybody's suddenly buying? And that allowed them to get onto Top of the Pops, the UK's big show. And I think when they were presented in all the documentaries and sort of like newsreel footage of the time. It was their manager who was like presented with them, talking for them and on behalf of them. And there was like this footage of him like working in like a potato farm where, he was like this sort of part-time potato merchant, um, and at the same time running a management empire from this little like house. And I think the perception of that, even when they had a number one single in America, they were still effectively run in Edinburgh, which I think was like a complete punch in the nose for the London record industry. And Malcolm McLaren has said, I think everyone thinks like tongue in cheek that he wanted to operate the Sex Pistols as though they were the Bay City Rollers, but I think he was genuine in that belief. And I know that he originally offered Mid-Year, the singer from Ultravox, and the role of the singer in the Sex Pistols when he met him as a band called Slick, a sort of like a Bay City Rollers wannabe band with the same songwriters. And I think that image of the impresario was something like McLaren took, and it's something like Bob Lass clearly took, and it's something Alan Horn clearly took. And I think Scotland, while it never had the recognition of being like a punk band, sort of country, they never had like a Sex Pistols or Clash, but they had these impresarios. When you look at Fast Product and Postcard, that is, the main focus on them. You talk about the managers as much as you do the bands because they just approach the record industry in a completely different way.
I did not expect the line from Bay City Rollers to Fast Product, but that is amazing. In Big Old Dream, the first documentary, I do also love, these were people and individuals that I was not as familiar with, but oh my God, you could make a monkey style film about the people in the fire engines alone, or the people who made up Scars. Like, they were such characters, even in the archival footage versus who they are now, like still wearing sunglasses, looking cool, saying really like kind of not upsetting things, but like kind of pointed, prickly things about, what happened then, how it is now, their regrets. And I love, there's that part, is it Paul Mackey who writes a letter to Susie?
Yeah.
So they have this letter. He's like, I have the letter here. And he wrote to Susie, he said, I hate you and I hate your band. I've only seen you once, but I'd never go to see you again. You were shit. Boring and derivative music has always made me sick, and you're the worst. Yours sincerely, Paul from the Scars. And he's holding up this like letter that's just like, you can see it's just fading through. But I'm like, there was a lot of arrogance in the scene in a way with like no gold dream in it. You know what I mean? It was complete fabrication of the mind. It's super fascinating.
I saw Big Gold Dream in the cinema. I saw it with Paul watching it for the first time, and I was sitting next to him. And when that scene with Davey holding up his letter came on, I could see him holding his hands onto his face, like slinking down the street. Because he'd obviously completely forgotten that he'd written that and that Davey had it, 40 years later. But to me, it's these characters. They're so important to any of these stories. There's a fantastic Scottish writer called David Keenan who wrote a book called This Is Memorial Device, and he discusses a lot about these characters, that every town has these amazing characters. And I remember when I was in school, just the very start of high school, there's a guy in the high street and he had like five punks tattooed on his forehead. It's just sort of,
Wow.
it was like a wild statement. And this would have been, sort of the late 80s, 10 years at least after the punk revolution. All these people are such, even if this guy was not making music, I have no idea who he was, but everybody recognized him, and every scene is made up from these people, and I think that's like fascinating. I think it's like punk drew these like mavericks together. It is so you're in Scotland, especially it's like full of like small towns and small cities, and a lot of places like Glasgow are very hard towns. And for these people to want to dress as they did and make this music, it's it just fascinates me, and it doesn't matter if it's the singer, songwriter, drummer, whoever it is. It's just like characters that I like having in these films because they can tell the story in a far more interesting way than somebody who is so media savvy that they just read from a script. They do it every day, and to me that's what makes the music interesting. I've been very lucky that all the people I can remember are like spoken to have been lovely and forthcoming, but a lot of these people can be prickly, but if they weren't, you wouldn't have the great music that they made.
Yeah.
It takes those spiky characters to make music, and when you have four spiky characters like that in a room, things are going to happen, and that's what it's about for me.
The Josef K album that they talk about in this film, they make a record, Sorry for Laughing, and they have problems with it. They're like, it's too glossy. I think that album's amazing. It's come out in retrospect. So they go back in to make their other record. And I love that you have the journalists just talking about what could have been. And he writes, he does say, he says, what could have been, says I'm appalled. Will there be a third time? Can they forget their past? Josef K have cheapened themselves and cheated the world. Not bad for a first LP. And I'm just like, okay, there it is again. This interplay of like I hate this, but hey, not bad. You upset me. Good job. What is your feeling about the place of the UK press looking at, like London press looking at Scotland and trying to honor it versus being like, well, this is kind of happening out of our circle. We can't give it as much attention as we want.
It's interesting, just firstly with Sorry for Laughing. I'm just like, I find it amazing that they thought that the record was so glossily produced, like it was something like Sly and Robbie or 10cc had.
No, it's super rough. It's like, I don't get it. I don't get what they were hearing.
It's amazing, and it's just that level of self-belief and like will of like pushing things forward. It's fascinating, and I think when you mention the press are just like fascinating. The press in Britain are so different from anywhere else in the world. You've probably seen, any time in the mainstream press, like the tabloid newspapers we have, they just love to build somebody up and then bring them down. And the music press was like very much like that as well. And there was definitely a period in the 1980s and into the 1990s where you would have like the vicious attack on a band for no apparent reason. And I think people now are really sort of starting to like reassess, that whole period and like how damaging it was to people. And I've spoken to people in these films, and that's had like such a huge negative, understandably, impact on their lives. And some people, even to this day, it's something which is incredibly damaging. And I think I remember Bill Drummond saying to me that he was quite cynical about the weekly newspapers focusing on different cities. And he said it was like a clever way for them to sell extra copies of newspapers in a city. Like 1 3 month period, they would cover like Liverpool, and everybody in Liverpool would like buy these weekly newspapers because it was featuring people they knew. And then, likewise in Glasgow,
Wow.
it's, I think there's probably an element of truth to that, but it's again the sort of like the centralized nature of the press at that time, much like the record industry at that time. And I think that's why the independent distribution networks and independent labels were like so great, because they could bypass part of that to an extent, and especially fanzine culture as well. And I think there's always a, a level of resentment for, it's that cliche of journalists being failed musicians. It's something that, if you had a single of the week in the NME, that would make a record label, because these record labels would, when you look at bands who've made like records, there's so many like one-off bands and one-off labels, and they all started out with the same intentions as like Postcard, Rough Trade, Fast Product, of becoming a record label, but because it's so expensive to do, if your first release was a failure, you wouldn't get the opportunity to do a second release. And so the music press was absolutely essential to the success of these labels, but they could also, at their own will, bring them down, and that power is something that I don't think was always used for best intentions.
No, I've talked to actors and musicians still over there who are still dealing with that. They're like,
Yeah,
I can't go too above my station or whatever you want to call it. Like, they love it when I'm struggling and they love to champion in it. And then all of a sudden they're like, you're dead to us. You're a joke. It's really wild. I've talked to people who still say that attitude's still kind of prevalent.
but that's why I think what you're doing, and like the online nature of a lot of like the music press now, it's not centralized, and it's far more, I think, I think anyway, more honest, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's like I book who I want on. I make this myself. It's DIY. It's like I have no advertising. I don't have anyone saying this subject matter is too provocative or your guest is too obscure. I'm like, I want Ann Magnuson on to talk about jazz on a summer's day. She picked it. That's it. Done. Done. We're doing it. But I did have a question about the three films. The first film has narration by Robert from The Go-Betweens. The third one, Teenage Superstar, has narration by Kim Deal. Then you have the Glasgow School, which is kind of like Big Gold Dream Side B, you call it. It's just an oral history, no narration. What made you choose these people to be the voice of these films, and how do you figure out the tone of like what you want to say in each of them?
The narration in Big on Dream, we had to have somebody that was related to the subject matter of the film, and the narration for it was written by our fantastic editor Angela Slavin, and Bill Drummond was going to be our original choice for it, but unfortunately he wasn't unavailable. And then the way these things work out, I think it's like fantastic. Eric Sandberg, one of the producers, suggested like Robert Foster, and it was just like, wow, what an amazing like idea. And because we didn't interview him for the film, and it just made so much sense. And because the narration, like, quite limited in the film, he doesn't come in until about sort of 10 minutes, and then we don't mention at the start in the credits who it is, and then people are thinking, is that Robert Foster? And
Yeah.
it just felt like the perfect person. And for Teenage Superstars, Kim Deal was you know the perfect choice. We had to have a female contributor, but because it's sort of, there's a fantastic film called Since Yesterday, which is about Scotland's like female
I
bands,
can't
and I
wait
think
to
it's
see
such,
it.
yeah, it's such an important film. And we, while the production part of it was like very female heavy, the contributors like weren't, and that was like not through any sort of like choice to make it very sort of like male heavy. It was just that the labels at the time had barely signed any like female artists, and we needed somebody connected with this story who was from a significant female for the story. And Kim Deal made so much sense to us because she was American, but she was also involved, in that scene. The first Breeders album was recorded in Edinburgh. She'd been on tour with like Teenage Fanclub. Pixies had covered Jesus and Mary Chain songs, and for the Glasgow School, that was effectively, it was like a blueprint for what would become Hungry Beat. It was the reason the first book came into existence, and it was like, led by Douglas McIntyre, the co-writer, a fantastic person to be involved. He was interviewed in the film. But the nature of like music documentaries is you have 90 minutes to tell a story. You have 45 minutes of music and archive, and you'll have like 45 minutes of like interview to tell the story. So it becomes very soundbitey. I wanted to use the interviews, the full part of the interview, just to delve deeper into the story. So it's like a companion to Big Gold Dream. If you want to know a little bit more of the story, you have this film, and it just didn't feel like it needed any narration or any archive or music. If you've seen if you haven't seen Big Gold Dream, it's just like, what the fuck's this? But if you have, it makes sense. It's just something to give you extra sort of color and flavor to that, and it didn't need a narrator for that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, and it's definitely like it's kind of exciting to go back in after you've seen the first one, because there are, I mean, again, like you said, 90 minutes is just, that's such a limited time to tell the story. So do you feel like the books allow you to just kind of expand on it, or are they limiting in their own way?
They're very different, and everything about this whole process has been sort of like naivety and jumping on my feet, sort of straight in, and oftentimes it comes like disastrous and psychologically disastrous for like bad decisions. And but what fascinated me, I thought, wow, we could just transcribe Big Gone Dream and then just like add a few extra bits into it, and it would become a book, an oral history. But what amazed me was, not being able to write a book, never having written a book, is that what appears on the page is very different from when people speak eye to eye. You can say so
Yes.
much in like a sly nod or a wink that completely doesn't translate onto a page. And they're just, although they're based on the same interviews, they're just two completely different um, you know forms of storytelling, and you had to explain far more and of like color the story with like far more background information in a book to be able to tell the same story. And when I say that, they were always like, sort of a companion film. Like Big Old Dream is like the sort of the concise, like snappy edit. And I know Postcards from Scotland especially, and Hungry Beat like annoy people because you have the same people telling the same story but from a different viewpoint. But that's something specifically wanted to do because everybody's truth is different, and I think it's like fascinating that it's like crime scene reconstruction,
Yes.
that some people's version of events is slightly different, and it had you can sort of triangulate and corroborate two people's like opposing, inverted commas, witness statement to their punk ears, by getting a third person in to say, yes, that person's right or that person's wrong. But I just loved the idea of, it is everybody's like truth. And if there is something you can read between the lines and interpret events yourself.
So Teenage Superstars, which was made quite a number of years later, it's way more sophisticated than Big Old Dream. Big Old Dream also musically and stylistically feels kind of darker and more haunted and kind of like scrappy. And the music in Teenage Superstar also like kind of changes the way that the film is made, to me at least, as a viewer. I mean, you've got like much more pop elements coming in than like spikier elements. And so when you were making Teenage Superstars, were you like, researching it differently, thinking about the edit differently? What did you bring to this that you had learned from the previous films?
It's funny you asked that question. Yeah, I never learn from my mistakes. I just make them again and again and again. And
Hey,
it's
I'm in your club too. All right, cool.
because when we made Big Old Dream, we started in 2005,
Yeah.
and such a long process to do. There was like a version of it which we put together in 2010, which was the very sort of early interviews, and you can probably say that in Big Gone Dream, it was filmed on mini DV, and it's sort of quite scrappy quality, but it was all I could afford at the time.
But it fits it. It fits the people you're talking to.
It was like it does, and that's like purely accidental. And as we were making it, I became. It was like it was like a pleasure to speak to the people in the film. And that's the thing I enjoy most. It's getting to meet your heroes in my day job, like in on like films, like American films. Very lucky in that we have lots of like bigger names of actors, and because I'd never get starstruck with anybody that I've met, but when I do some of these like interviews, like for like tiny, obscure like indie bands. To me, these are sort of like proper musical heroes, and I just like love finding out information, about
Yes.
these bands, and to try and get this story to more people. The way I approach these films is you have to have like a different story arc, and like within that you have something else you want to explore, and Teenage Superstars is more about the friendships, whereas Big Gone Dream is about sort of like taking on the record industry and like infiltrating the music industry. That was like the original subtitle of it. But when Big Gone Dream, it was so wild. At some point I realized, through the work of Angela Slavin, our editor, who was like, just such a fantastic editor and really brought the film to life. I kind of thought, well, actually, this is not too bad at all. This is like far better than my biggest expectations were when we started it. And as we started passing it around to people we knew, and it got accepted into the Edinburgh Film Festival, and also the BBC were keen to screen it. I was like, oh fuck! It's just like it's like somebody gives you this amazing like news, and it's just like, how can we possibly actually um, legally give them all of this,
Right.
because it is just like costs are astronomical, and BBC are very like cheeky in that you get a very small licensing fee for it. And in my head, I was like, I have no idea about this. I was thinking, well, well, I just thought like all musicians, that were going to be like throwing thousands of pounds at you, and then you quickly realise that that's just not the case. And so what we were being offered by the BBC to screen it was significantly less than what they were going to charge us to license the music to appear in the footage to appear in the film. It's just like, that doesn't feel
Right.
right. We eventually had to like put this together, and then get like music supervisors
Right.
involved, and like lawyers, and all this stuff that just felt so un DIY and not related to this.
Sure.
And it
Sure.
was just like sleepless nights, and like horrible anxiety dreams, and like losing like every single like penny you'd ever sort of had. It was like sort of like catastrophic. And then you have like little moments when it wins, and people say at the award at Edinburgh Film Festival, and people say they like it, which is like nice. And then you're thinking, oh no, it's like we've told everybody we've got this other film to make, and like coming directly from this sort of traumatic experience of being able to make this film screenable, you have to go through it all again. So you have a different perspective when you're putting that together.
Wow.
And that's probably why it's a little bit more, sort of like polished. And I think in a lot of ways, it maybe shouldn't have been as polished. I do remember sort of feeling at the time, probably like Josef K felt about that album. And then, so when you have like a bit of like perspective and you look at it and think, it still looks like a couple of folk running around with a tiny camera. There's, there's not a Marvel movie, but at some point you sort of think, well, this is not really this is trying to be like something the BBC would like make, rather than just making the best that you can to your limited abilities. But then when you get the perspective back, it's actually, no, this is a super low budget, and you can tell. And I think that's maybe why it worked, because subconsciously you're sort of operating in a similar way to the people you're within, that you're documenting. And I think their story is similar. And I think, to me, the fascinating thing with the Teenage Superstars era story is that it's so easy to make uh, an assumption that the jingly jangliness of the Glasgow bands in the mid 80s are a direct continuation of like Orange Juice's Postcard sounds. But I think there's like a big distinction in that when you look at the career of all of those bands featured in Big Gold Dream, as I'd mentioned about with the Basic Drawers and the sort of the London music industry, to be able to get onto the charts and onto top of the pops, you had to like really sort of like clean your image up, despite there being these few renegade impresarios who could change things. In the whole, you had to like polish your sound up like dramatically, and that's why a lot of these bands, I think, lost their sort of spirit. I'm not a huge fan. I know some people disagree, of later Orange Juice. It's like far too polished, despite having great songwriting. It's the postcard that fascinates me, and I think a lot of the bands from all these bands are split up really in close succession, like Joseph K, Fire Engines, Orange Juice slightly after. And I think a lot of the bands in the Teenage Superstars era period saw what had happened to their heroes. That was for the first time with Orange Juice, especially people from Glasgow were seeing people like them appearing in magazines and on newspapers, and then without having to change their heart and what they were doing. And then one day they saw them glossy and on top of the pop. And I think and signing to major labels, and I think they thought, "Fuck that, we don't have to do that." And it was almost like a punk moment had happened, a year zero moment had happened again in such a short space of time. It was just 4 years later, and it's like the G's and Mary chain, which I think really brought that back, that you could be like raw and have like lots of like press interest. And that's really the story of Teenage Superstars, is this distinction. They saw something bad had happened,
Right.
and they wanted to change it and be like, we don't actually have to clean ourselves up to be able to do this. We can just continue as we want.
Speaking of the Jesus and Mary chain, Douglas Hart, who you interview in the film, seems like a total sweetheart. Like my impression of the Jesus and Mary chain was always like, oh yeah, like forget it. I would never want to meet them. But I really love that you got him, because he just brought a perspective to it that, and kind of a heart to their story that I didn't really know about.
Yeah, Douglas is sweetheart is the word I would use. I think he's an incredible person in terms of like my like drama filmmaking career. He's like a huge inspiration to me. His music videos, I think, are like incredible. The stuff he did with Creation in the mid 80s, they're just like fantastic. And he is an unsung hero of a filmmaker, and he's been so important. We don't feature him so much in what he brought to the Postcards from Scotland era, which is like features a lot of the Edinburgh timeline of that same story with what was happening in Edinburgh in parallel. But Douglas was so important to that scene. He produced so many of their records. He was also a member of like Meet Whiplash and Meet Whiplash. Eddie Connolly, their bass player, set up Neurotic Records, and they put out records by Fizz Bombs, Jesse Garin, and the Desperados, and the Vultures. He was such an important person to this story. Jim declined an interview, but when we went to license the music, they were the first ones to like put their thumbs up and go, "Yeah, that's
Oh,
fine
that's
to do
amazing.
that." So, yeah, they're actually they're good guys, and like fantastic band.
Yeah, your footage in it is amazing. You got the iconic interview where they're talking about, Joy Division being shit.
The site, the New Musical Express, says you are the best live band at this moment. They also say that you are streets ahead of, for instance, Joy Division. In the things you do, that must mean big responsibility.
No, not really, because it's not difficult to be streets ahead of Joy Division.
God.
No, Joy Division were particularly awful, though. Joy Division were shit. Joy Division were fucking rubbish. I don't even like us being mentioned in the same sentence as Joy Division.
Oh, God. What was wrong about Joy Division?
They were so awful. They were so unambitious. They took themselves totally seriously. Don't even talk about Joy Division.
Where did you get the footage of the riot that happened with them playing? What was the venue they played? It was in London, right?
It was, yeah, the North London Polytechnic.
Okay.
That was probably one of the inspirations for making Teenage Superstar, seeing that footage, because it's just such an unbelievable story that there was a riot caused by a band playing, but not just the sort of the riots you read like with Jim Morrison and the Doors, where there's a few people sort of like shouting. This is literally you know um smashing like everything in sight, like kindling like the stage and speakers and PA, and with a threat of like real serious violence.
In a short period of time, too, right? Like they weren't on stage very long, right? Like what, 12 minutes or something like that?
Yeah, and we cover it a lot in Postcards from Scotland, and while the story's been told a lot, I thought it was like important to tell it from the perspective of everyone else, which was in it, and it was just the band come on stage. People at that time would go, the the media interest. We were talking about the role of newspapers and like fanzines and weeklies within the story. It's like the Jesus and Mary Chain was like such a breath of fresh air for them, because it excuse me, was like the return of the Sex Pistols and like punk in 1976 and 7. And the story basically was that there are four drunk guys on stage. They play for like 15, 20 minutes, and they fall about for most of that, and then the crowd go crazy and start fighting them. And to a lot of people reading about that, it's like, well, I'm going to go along to that next gig, and they do exactly the same thing, and it becomes
Right.
the story. So rather than people reacting from something unknown on stage, people are waiting for the moment when this is all going to kick off. And that was very much the story of the London North Polytechnic gig, of the bands. I don't think it would matter who was on stage. They were waiting for the Jesus and Mary Chain to come on, and anything else was getting in the way of that riot about to happen.
The other thing I love about the film is there's so many funny, sweet stories in it. You know, whether it's Stephen Pastel getting a haircut for the first time and being like, "Oh, my ears hurt from the sun hitting it," or Francis from the Vaselines being like, "I didn't want to be in the band when we were called the Pretty Flowers because we changed our name from the Child Molesters." She's like, "I don't want to be in a band called the Pretty Flowers." She's like, "We played a school and got banned." She's like, there's so many little amazing things that come about from people just being in proximity of other people, just standing next to people and starting bands. And the fact that, like, even where geographically is Bells Hill?
It is outside Glasgow. It's a satellite town of Glasgow. I think it's maybe 10, 50 miles outside. It's in the greater Glasgow metropolitan area.
Yeah, that the BMX Bandits, Teenage Fanclub, and the Soup Dragons all came out of this area, and they all knew each other. That story where they're starting their bands, they're all kind of interchangeable, and they're in, is it Norman's grandmother's house? Yeah, and they're like, someone will put the bass down and go to drums, and then a different singer will pop up and they'll do a song, and the rest of the other bands sit and watch, and then it's time for another band to do their song, and they change the lineup. I mean, that's magic, and I just love that these three bands, I mean, BMX Bandits are probably the least known, but they're beloved, right? Still. And the fact that they're all, like, you know, played with each other and kind of supported each other, but kind of spiraled out into their own history is fascinating, that they're just same age, same time, and part of the same universe.
No, I think it's almost unique, and it fascinates me. You have scenes like the Bromley Contingent, one of the early sort of London punk scenes, which Adam Ant came out of, and Susie Sue, and they were all friends, but there was I think a huge difference between them and what was happening in Bells Hill, and it is I think, as you mentioned, it's the sort of the magic that they have between them, and that's really, I think, the heart of these films. Well, it'd be so easy to have, in Big Old Dream as well, everything being sort of like austere and grey, and Edinburgh being dark, and everybody talking about their experiences, and being sort of very pretentious about it all. It's like what made the bands, for me, it's a universal, like, excitement of young people getting together and discussing their dreams, and it just doesn't need to be about just music. It's like for everything, and for me, it's important to have these moments, which I think a lot of people would just dismiss and say, what, I want to just hear about how this record was made and how you did this guitar line,
Right.
and this drum beat, and I don't think that's what makes the music. It's like the little moments between people, and the nourishment that like Norman Douglas and Sean had with each other. That's what made the bands what they are. And it's like with bands, like every teenager, you have little moments where you fall out, but you're still friends, and they're all still friends today. And amazingly, they're making some of their best music. The new BMX Bandits, I think, his album is the best one they put out. Sean,
I agree.
the album is fantastic, the one he did with David McClyman, and it become they never would have made that music if they didn't have that bond and friendship and that encouragement for each other, and just making bands up for the fun of it, as you say, swapping instruments, which seems to be a really Scottish thing. They did that a lot in Edinburgh as well. They would just swap instruments and become a new band.
I love it. And there's such a sweetness to it, too. I mean, the shop assistants were like, oh, we saw a picture of the Pastels, and they had like a swell maps poster on the wall. And that was good enough for us to work with them. Or Stephen helping the Vaselines record, in the studio for the first time. And they're like, oh, he was really helpful in terms of us like no one in Glasgow liked us. No one would go see us. Like Norman had a club, Pink Swastika, I believe, and the Vaselines were playing, and like no one there, no one thought they were good, but they're incredible. The Vaselines are like amazing, and I just love the fact that it was all there, and they kind of just needed some encouragement.
I think encouragement is such an important part of this. I think I strongly believe, as I touched upon, that for a lot of these Glasgow bands, seeing Orange Juice being praised in Postcards Records, in newsprint, for a lot of like young people, especially in Scotland that time, they'd never experienced encouragement, at schools at the time, unless you went to, a public school where, you were sort of taught that you're better than everyone and you can sort of do anything.
And a public school is private school. There.
Exactly. Confusingly, yes,
Okay.
Just not to, it's important to make. Teaching and sort of like parenting, just like encouraging and sort of like nourishing somebody to believe that they can do something is such an important aspect of all of this. Likewise, it's like almost like a horseshoe. You either have, maybe something like some sort of nihilistic, band. You have like your sort of like hate and want to, you're willing to sort of like prove everybody wrong. Is sort of like the same as like sort of like encouragement. There's like a part where it meets, but clearly encouragement and sort of like love and sort of friendship, I think, are like far more positive and important, and you actually get like nice people doing stuff for each other. And I think at the heart of all good music.
Well, and it seemed like two positive things did happen from the press that influenced everyone and helped them along. One was the Julian Cope article about garage bands, chocolate watch bands, love, things that people just in the scene had just heard on the periphery, and it was kind of laid out as like a blueprint for people to find these records and share them. And the other one was, basically the NME, this C86 cassette. And can you talk about the importance of that? Because I had always heard that C86 cassette, like just as a phrase, right? I had no context because I'd seen it kind of made fun of. I'd seen it propped up, but it was a really big deal when that came out.
Absolutely. It's and you'll have, depending on who you talk to, I think they all have like very sort of valid reasons. You'll get very different responses from people. Some people hate the term and refer to it as like the C word. It is. It's just such a fascinating and interesting record, because half of it, when you actually sit down and listen to it, half of it is what we would think of, and now call C86 as a genre. It's the sort of jingly jangly West Coast birds influenced melodic bands. But the other half is like all these sort of like Johnson bands, and there's like really abrasive, angular post-punk bands. It's almost like Postcard Records sort of label. You have the Orange Juice type bands, and then you have like the harsher bands like Josef K. And for some reason, everybody seems to have forgotten about all these sort of like hard, probably I would say like Josef K and Pop Group and Gang of Four, the sort of like antecedents of those other bands. And they've created like an entire different scene which has run sort of parallel to Glasgow's scene, and that was responsible for what would eventually become a scene which like nourished like Franz Ferdinand and like Mogwai, all those sort of like harder scenes. And I think quite rightly for that, it's not fully representative of that scene, and just due to the nature of musicians, they don't want to be like associated with somebody saying, "Oh, this is what you sound like, and this is your genre." And completely right. But the reality is that but bands were spawned like from that, because you have it's Velocity Girl by like Primal Scream, and you have the Soup Dragons on it, and like Shop Assistants, and they are the sort of like architects of that sound. So in some ways, I think it's, even though a lot of those bands formed 2 years and before C86, I think it's fair to say that C86 can be a genre, and like a lot of things, that has now become defined. You can, if you say C86 to somebody, they're going to think of Primal Scream, or one of those jingly jangly bands, and that's fair enough.
You mentioned Primal Scream being jingly jangly, but what's really fascinating is, the moment where they aren't jangly and the moment where the Soup Dragons embrace dance culture. Like, as somebody who was listening to this music come out at that time, as it was being released, did that feel like a natural progression to you, or did that feel weird?
Well, for me, it's I was slightly in Teenage Superstars. The '80s bands were ever so slightly too young for me, and my first impressions of these bands coming out would have been Captain America and the Super. And so,
Okay.
like, from sort of like 1990, 91. So for me, it's difficult to, you know, without, historically, interviewing people, and like to, create that narrative. I don't have that firsthand perspective of that. But for the people that I've spoken to, fans and the musicians themselves and the press associated, it was very strange, because a lot of like music scenes only last for 2 or 3 years, and for the Soup Dragons, they'd had that period. But when you look at something like the Beatles in their 1962 to 1970 recording period, like from 1964 onwards, almost every album was moving forward and progressing. When you listen to Or Never Owns Most compared with like She Loves You, it's like 3 years apart, and it's like something, it's like 20 light years of like difference, and I think the band should be moving forwards. And like Sean Dixon had an electronic album out in sort of like mid '80s, and it's just been re-released, and it's very electronic. And the reality is that they had uh, an electronic music, an electronic record with electronic drums and guitars on it before Primal Scream. And that music, I would probably say that the Shaman and Finney Tribe were experimenting with that, long before. And obviously, you have the Manchester bands like Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses experimenting with that. It's just like, by its nature, that indie jingly jangly music can't continue, because music just like progresses, and you either disband, or you continue playing that same music, or you use the influences of what is happening often now to make music. And to me, there's nothing wrong with the Soup Dragons, and their progression seems perfectly fine to me. It's ironically Primal Scream's progression that seems more still today. I think Screamadelica is a wonderful record, and it's like Andy Werthel and Flood, which put that record together. I think it's probably, a lot of people definitely disagree with a misnomer for it being labelled and sort of like as a Primal Scream record. And I think it's an Andy Weatherhall record, with Primal Scream contributing. It's like loaded as one of their earlier records, remixed and then sort of presented back to Primal Scream. And I know that Bobby Gillespie complained that his voice wasn't on it enough, and it's really when people start talking about how great it is, and like how you've progressed music so forward, that people, oh, actually, no, you're right, you're absolutely right. And then that becomes the intention is like that Tony Wilson praxis
Right.
theory that you do something, and then it's only later that you realize why you've done it. And I think Screamadelica for Primal Scream was like very much off that. It was something they went along with, and then they justified that it was always their intention to make that record in that way. Not being too. That's my political opinion on that record. A great record. A great record.
Well, you talked about the growth of a band, like the Soup Dragons, changing sound from jangly to, kind of a dance-oriented music. But you have a band like Teenage Fanclub that has like a language. And even though they do, there are albums that kind of, have pushed what they've done with guitar music. But it's like you hear Teenage Fanclub and you immediately know it's Teenage Fanclub. And one of the things I really loved in the film was just how frank they were about that moment where they were poised to be the next Nirvana. I know that's a phrase that's really overused, but they were on the same label. They played Saturday Night Live, and that we can't underestimate how much Bandwagon-esque hit America, and they talk about that. But it is also kind of incredible how cool they are about it not happening. They're just like, yeah, we kind of would be upfront about like what we thought of records that we were making and if we had problems with them, and people started reading in the stuff, and even Alan from Creation was like, I don't think they were ruthless enough, and I love that Teenage Fanclub has seemed to like remain true to themselves after all these years. Like I've never felt like they've put on an air of like going for it or trying to be something they're not. And they still make music that just devastates me.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head that they remain true to themselves. And I think it's probably unique. And I think it's completely genuine. I think they are such nice people, and their attitude really is that they will do their own thing. They do fascinate me, and I really hope that somebody does a book specifically about them or a film specifically about them. I don't think they'll like do it. They would never do that themselves because they would just not. It'd be why would we do that?
Do you feel like you could be the person to do it though, or
No, I think if anyone could do it, I don't think it should be me. I think it should be a young female fan who's like 16 or 17 doing it, if anyone. But in a lot of ways, I love the idea that they don't do it. They just genuinely have no interest in doing it. They'll do interviews for magazines, because it just has to be done, or somebody asks them. And I think as Raymond mentioned it, I'll probably have to slightly paraphrase because I can't remember it. He just says if somebody asks them to do something, they'll think about it and just do their own thing. And it's remarkable. And I think that they are such amazing songwriters. And I think one thing about them I think is completely unfair is they're labeled as being a band that sound like Big Star. I think at best, you could say Bandwagon-esque, sounded a little bit like Big Star, and parts of like 13, but the album before sounded nothing like Big Star. It was like, if anything, it's like maybe like Dance Virginia, but they just do their own thing. And then the album after is like, wild, West Coast singer, songwriter, and they can write some of the most amazing songs. And I genuinely think that they could have like if there was any other band, they could have ridden that Nirvana wave, and they just chose not to do it. And you just have to absolutely respect them for doing that. I just love that some people exist to have the ability to do something, but for their own beliefs, they don't do it. Like Scott Walker, his career is like fascinating. It's like writing or singing, I should say. the sun ain't gonna shine anymore, and the string of like 60s hits, then some bizarre like just indescribable trying to recreate 20th century forms of music, like with tilt and but easily he could have like written this great song. And what he was quite extreme in that music. What I love most about when you talk about these characters who are like John Lydon, and people are sort of like combative in doing their own thing. Teenage Fanclub just do it as the nicest people you can imagine. There's something, even more like punk rock about that. Just being nice and not caring what anyone else thinks, literally. And um, it's just astounding. And they couldn't have been as big as Nirvana. And I think Alan was right. They weren't ruthless enough. They didn't want it enough because, as you'll know from people that you've met, and from people that I've met, it's like the people that really make it, they have to do a lot of things to do that. And that's just not them. It's like, the amazing songwriting is just not enough to like break into the world of music. It all happens, in such rare situations, like Nirvana. I think that was like a natural thing that just like took everybody by surprise. But to
Absolutely.
emulate that, you can't do that, and they would never do it.
Yeah. No, and a part of the film is about Kurt's death and how that really kind of, they felt like the scene changed after his death, and then that was also the ascent of like Britpop, and things changing. And so it's kind of weird to look at it as like the end of this chapter, even though a lot of the bands, Vaselines would still make records later on with Sub Pop, and Teenage Fanclub kept creating, and so did BMX Bandits. Um, it's interesting that, that was kind of a capper in terms of what was going on at this point.
Yeah, I think so. Timing in music, as he says in the film, is such an important thing. And I think things probably had run their course. I think when you're, when I say you as in like us as the sort of like filmmakers are talking about like Kurt Cobain, you have to be. It's very easy for someone like me to, write about him as some big superstar that I never met him, that you have no connection with. But for him, he was like a personal friend of these people, and you have to be sort of like sensitive, like to him being their friend. And just an amazing thing that they crossed paths. It's with the Captain America, and Nirvana. So the Captain America tour, when Nevermind was just about to come out, like Smells Like Teen Spirit had just come out, and like Kurt had taken Captain America on tour with them. It was just before uh Nevermind came out, and it's like, as you said, it's just incredible like how huge that was. They were booked into like small venues, but unknown to anyone at the time, this record was just like on the horizon, and literally it's like one of those few moments where music would change, and like the public knew all of that before any of the label managers or anybody was there. And for them to like witness and be part of seeing this band become so huge is just like, remarkable. And for these people, for that to be part of their story, and for Kurt Cobain to appreciate that music and to have heard the Vaselines, who, as you mentioned, played to like only handfuls of people as a, you know, under their own name, and like a support act, for maybe a few people more. But it seems almost unfathomable that it could reach, Seattle, and like Calvin Johnson and him, this record that would just sell like a handful of copies, and for that to have had an impact, and then for for that music to influence them, for him, and then his music to influence Teenage Fanclub and Captain America. It's just like it's almost like British and American music in the 60s with the Beach Boys inspiring Beatles and Beatles inspiring Beach Boys and Birds and Beatles, going round and round. And it's like amazing. And that's just, I think, such a unique story. And I think when you see Nirvana and Eugene playing on stage, as it says in the film, you can see, Nirvana are delighted to have him on stage. And I remember we've seen that footage on like YouTube when it first came out, and looked like we amazingly got. It was the guy, David, who did The Year That Punk Broke.
Oh, Dave Markey.
He had this. He's like fantastic. He had footage from that gig that he hadn't seen, so we got access to it, which was like amazing. But the other footage from that concert was on YouTube, and I remember seeing some comment, and somebody was saying, "Who the fuck's that getting on stage with Kurt?"
Yes, totally. It's so beautiful. They're playing his song, and he just runs out with his backpack on and starts singing. And of course, if you don't know who he is, you're like, why is some roadie singing this song? But it's beautiful. And they are in hog heaven that he's there and doing it. Yeah. It's like a big deal for them, for Nirvana. And it's a big deal for Eugene too. It's just that, that's a very special moment that I loved in your film.
It's just, I think it's just one of those great moments, and you can see when you see it's 1991, I think, and then when you see 92 footage, or it's 19 and 91, the crowds are so vastly different.
I played with Nirvana the day their album went gold because I was on Sub Pop at that time.
Fantastic! Cool.
So I was on Sub Pop pre Nevermind, and I was on Sub Pop post Nevermind, and I remember it was us, Mudhoney, and Nirvana, and no one expected it. And I remember standing next to Jonathan Podman of Sub Pop and us being in disbelief at the energy being thrown back at Nirvana. Wow. We up to that point, you'd go see Husker Du or something, and people would stand there and nod their head and be into it, but no one was. It wasn't like 2,000 people screaming the lyrics back to an underground band, wow. like Beatlemania. And I remember Pauly, came on, and you couldn't hear the band, and it was just so weird. And we were looked at each other and we're like, wow. And again, it was a short movement as well, in terms of Nirvana's, what they influenced and how long that could go on, and some of the copycat bands and things like that. But it is amazing that, like you said, that it was like a continuum. They were devouring music from Scotland. They recorded 3 Vaseline covers, which is incredible. And, for a lot of people, it was where they heard them first, and then the fact that they're bringing Captain America on tour, like you said, it's beautiful. You forget that Nirvana were just like fans. They were just kids from a weird part of Washington who all of a sudden were getting to play with Sonic Youth and have the Vaselines. It was exciting, it was made out of innocence, just like this scene.
And did you feel that something big, could you imagine that it was going to get as big as it did?
No. I mean, Nirvana were a local band, right? They're from our part of the world. No one was big in the underground. The biggest bands were Husker Du maybe, or the Replacements, and and so there was still a limit to it. But no, not at all. They were just another great Sub Pop band that you're would play to maybe a couple hundred people if you were lucky. There was no. It was just time, place, fluke. No one, it makes sense. I get why it got popular, but at the same time, I could easily imagine it not selling and it just being this little record.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I think imagine for in your contemporaries, just knowing that somebody from this underground scene had, done it. Not that anybody was like really there to become as big as the Beatles, but just that you could break into the industry. It must have been amazing.
Well, and also it was really weird because right away Nirvana were sellouts. It was like not their fault, right? They just were making music and they're making the records they want. And, that was still an era where, that term was thrown around a lot. And, my time on Sub Pop before Nirvana was much different. I mean, yeah, my time on Sub Pop before Nevermind came out was much different in terms of the relationship with the label, their expectations, which were none, their money, which was none. And then afterwards, there was definitely expectations. There was definitely hope and chance that maybe something could happen, because all of a sudden it's like, maybe the Afghan Wigs are their next big band, or maybe it's going to be Mudhoney, or, and yeah, we couldn't last. It was just, we were a young band that was not made to even make music for over 2 years. Cause we, again, a band where you're just kind of shoved in with each other because you all like Bob Mould. And then all of a sudden you start learning who you are, right? And you're young, and then you're like, yeah, I don't think we're going to be in this band anymore. And that's the way, the scene is like that. I love that Douglas and the BMX Bandits said something about the golden time before bands getting big. And, I think, we're talking about people who remained outsiders, and still had influence and made music that has resonated still to this day. It's remarkable.
No, it is, absolutely. And, that's, why I'm saying that, it's important, for, these stories to me, they're universal. They're not specifically Scottish, but,
right.
I'm telling them from a Scottish perspective, because to me, I just don't think that the general public, and especially people who have any ability to, counsellors or people from arts councils generally understand this music, but it touches so many people throughout the world, and it's been proven. It's like it touches people, and being sort of business minded, it can generate for record labels and industries. It's generated a lot of revenue from people just sitting in their bedrooms making a couple of songs. It's amazing.
Well, just play them Everything Flows and just watch them cry. Like it would be like, this is one of the greatest songs ever written. Please support the arts. Oh my God. I want to thank you so much, Grant, for coming on and spending the time talking about this scene. I have such respect for it. And now that I'm married to someone from Glasgow and have actually got to see like what it feels like to make, like it's like being in New York or LA, where you're like, oh, I get the light in LA is different. That's why bands like Wall of Voodoo and the Plugs and the Bags and the Germs existed. And you go to Glasgow and you see a different type of light, and you're like, oh, I get why this is that way. It's been a real thrill to have, the series of documentaries and the book as well. But before I ask the last question, what are you working on next?
Working on, as I mentioned, I continually make the same mistakes again and again. And I have said I would never make a music documentary again. And a few years later, it was like, okay, I could just do one, because I'd always had burning desire to sort of fully explore like Liverpool's post-punk scene. And it's been covered a lot of times, but there are lots of characters that I don't think have been properly recognised. One being,
like, who would that be?
Paul Simpson from the Wild Swans. He's just put out a fantastic book. So it started off that thinking I'll never do it, and then I thought, okay, we could just do it a little bit smaller scale, and in relative terms, something that can manage with limited resources. And then it sort of got bigger, and it ended up becoming 3 feature films, sort of exploring Liverpool's like underground scene from the 60s after the Beatles left to
Wow.
the most obscure bands imaginable from Liverpool, with some books to tie in with that. So that's taken up the last few years, and all my black hairs have gone, and my anxiety levels have returned to high alert. But it's been hugely enjoyable. So, like all these projects we have, it nearly finished. One film is like completely complete, and unfortunately, it's like the timing is not great for any sort of music documentary at the moment. There's like a bit of a crisis in the film industry at the moment, but hopefully things will recover, because I'd love to get this film out and the book to come along with it.
I'm here. I'll be ready. I'll devour it. I'm ready to go. You've made this work, so this is a little unfair, but I still have to ask this question, and I tailor it depending on what we're talking about it, so it's always a little different. So on a scale from 1 minute being the highest and 12 minutes being the lowest, how many minutes of the Jesus and Mary chain playing a set before a riot starts up do you give your body of work on the Scottish indie scene? 1 minute being the greatest because the riot started right away, to 12 minutes where it was more of a slow burn. They got 3 songs out.
I last saw Jesus and Mary Chain when they did, I think it was their 30th anniversary of Psycho Candy. And I'd seen the same venue, My Bloody Valentine, at the height of their ear-destroying powers. And this was quite pedestrian. And I think because so much has been written about those early gigs, which I was like far too young to see, you'd have to go for the minute for it to kick off, like straight,
Yes.
just to witness it. I've got the records. I've seen them perform their 50-minute set at 50-year-old ears level, and I would just love to witness the full explosion in not even a minute, even under a minute. The second they come on, they fall over, and the crowd just like jump on them, and they fight back. And I've never been in a fight, and I don't like seeing fights, but I think to witness this from a safe vantage point, a little window at the top of the venue, would be quite interesting.
Well, I give your body of work 1 minute as well. I'm going to put links in the show notes to the films. They're all available through streaming in America, so I will put that there for you to be able to find it, as well as to get the new book. It's fantastic. I just love what you're doing, and I get it. It's like you have to do it. These stories have to be captured. They have to be told. If not, who else is going to do it, right?
Yeah, well, that's part of keep on doing it, because I just hoped, and I really do hope, because I don't have much like dark hair left. It's all going grey, and so my blood pressure, it's like I hoped that more people would come and tell these stories. It's like important, and young people, that's what it means. All these films shouldn't be made by me. I was maybe young when I started, but it's still something that speaks to young people, and
yeah,
it's universal, and I think it really is. And I'd love to see young people's perspectives on it. And for every scene, everyone should be doing stuff like that in their own sort of areas, because it all connects. It's all the same story, just told from different towns and cities throughout the world.
Yeah, and they all got amazing creatures in it. It's like these stories need to be told. And but thank you for capturing what you've done, and I really appreciate you being here, Grant. It means a lot.
No, thank you so much, Chris. It's like an honor to be on your show, and it's been great speaking to you. So thank you.
And next time I'm in Glasgow, I'll head over to Edinburgh and we'll have an Iron Brew together. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday on your favorite podcast app, and additional bonus episodes every Sunday on our Patreon. The show's a completely independent affair, so the best way to support the show is through our Patreon at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get weekly bonus episodes and shows, exclusive limited edition flexi discs and records and CDs featuring guests that have appeared on the show, and other exclusive goods sent to you just for joining. You can follow us on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and also find out more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!